COVID-19 outbreak and subsequent search for a vaccine has highlighted the critical need for greater collaboration and innovative use of medical technology like no other event in living history. It has sparked a growing trend of collaboration and teamwork between a variety of public and private organisations, healthcare providers, research institutions, tech vendors, and even competitors. While this is an encouraging sign that organisations can work together to deliver better health outcomes, there still exists many barriers that are holding us back. Siloed data sets, disparate regulatory frameworks, commercial interests, and concerns over patient privacy has meant to date collaboration in our healthcare system is more a pipe dream than a reality. What foundations do we need in place to build a truly collaborative approach to healthcare? Where have we experienced successful collaborations, and what lessons can we take from these to create new opportunities? And which collaborations will bring the biggest rewards? We are joined today by Emma Hossack, CEO of the Medical Software Industry Association and Director of the Australian Digital Health Agency. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you.
Dr Nathan Pinksier, GP and Digital Health Advisor. Welcome, Nathan.
Good morning, Charlotte.
Dr Mark Belay, General Manager of Digital Hospital Innovation at Telstra Health. Hi, Mark.
Good morning.
And Chloe Ciafelli, Associate Director at Datacom, an organisation maximising patient care and empowering healthcare professionals with automation and next-gen tech. Hi, Chloe. How are you going?
Thanks for having me.
And Professor Trish Williams, CISCO Chair and Professor in Digital Health Systems at Flinders University, South Australia, and Co-Director of the Flinders Digital Health Research Centre. Welcome, Trish.
Morning, Charlotte.
Thank you so much for joining me here today. Look, COVID-19 has ignited unprecedented collaboration across organisations, industries, academia and governments, and has irrefutably demonstrated the value of partnering to deliver new solutions and have improved outcomes. Why is it, do you think, that we can pull together in a time of crisis and not in normal times? I'll open this first question to the floor.
Well, I might start with that question. Thanks, Charlotte. I think it was easier, well, not necessarily easier, but, we had a push and a reason, and time was of the essence. And without that incentive, and being able to put extra resources to that, that's one of the reasons we were able to bring those things, obviously together. And normally a lot of those things are not there. Or are not persuasive. So whilst we might think we want to do them, if there's no resources and funding models that support that, then often we just don't get the time to do it.
Absolutely. I'd agree with what Trish said. I also think that there's a few other reasons as well. And I think that something like interoperability is so complicated that unless you've got a very, very clear understanding of what you're trying to achieve, how, when, etc., it's a bit of a huge ask to say, okay, let's just all get interoperable. Obviously, we've seen that internationally. So I think with COVID, the message was very clear. We needed the messaging systems to work with the national systems. We needed the GPs to be able to immediately upload to the Australian Immunisation Register for obvious reasons. The general community realised that they could do a lot of things online, and they were linked up and connected, so that gave commercial imperatives to the telehealth systems, which in turn were incentivised by the government providing funding. So you had clear purpose, you had funding, and like we're all lazy fundamentally, human beings don't like change, and there's a super important nudge. You always need to have a commercial, a personal, a philosophical, or some other compelling reason to change what you're doing. That's just what we're like. And this is probably one of the toughest and most complicated areas in the world to actually solve.
Great point, Emma.
So could I just put a slightly different spin on this? My view is that we'd spent maybe 2 decades battling alone as industry, and most of the people on this call recognise this, trying to build the foundation services for health. The healthcare identifiers, the National Authentication Service, electronic prescriptions, My Health Record, and most of the public, and probably I'd argue most of government, wasn't all that interested. These were things that were happening in the background that had no political imperative. And then along comes COVID, and guess what? People need to start to be able to communicate to each other, all the things that Trish and Emma had just outlined. And the first example of that was electronic prescriptions. The framework for electronic prescription didn't happen overnight. It wasn't magic. It was actually built well over a decade ago. And we then get to a world where, guess what, we're doing telehealth consultations over the internet, but I have to physically somehow magically hand you a prescription. That didn't work very well. So the driver to accelerate electronic prescriptions became paramount. And then within a few months, we saw industry get together and fast track what had been a very long process, and it became a reality. So my position is that I think we had a lot of these foundation services in place, and it was just a question of turning on the switch, or there needed a driver, the nudge, as Emma said, and the nudge happened very quickly.
Great point, Nathan.
There's nothing like a crisis to bring everybody together into a common purpose, is there? So these things like electronic prescribing and telehealth always had tremendous value, but that common understanding across government, across health service providers, and just a broader section of the community wasn't there until the pandemic really put it front and centre. So why can we pull together in a time of crisis? It's just about aligning a much bigger section of the community to one single purpose.
I think it's such interesting points that you all raise. You know, the fact that GPs and the whole industry has been vocal for such a long time about what's possible. And I guess in some ways it's a shame that it takes a crisis to see the benefit of working together. Do we think this is a turning point? Are we going to continue on in this path, or is it just a temporary cooperation effort? What are the opinions in the group?
I've got a starting one. I think it's the first time I've ever heard the Secretary of Health in Australia refer to interoperability. It's normally one of those kind of technical words which you just don't expect to hear from that level of government and the department. And I think that was really refreshing when Brendan Murphy did that, was I think at least 18 months ago now. And that was, to me, I suppose, signalled a massive change, which we're now seeing, and it will have to reflect in the kind of payments that GPs are also getting as well, because they can't be expected to take up new systems and services and learn new things if it's not actually going to be sustainable business-wise for them either. It's just not fair. So you're seeing the government kind of understanding, actually there is the ability for these systems to interoperate. Hello, a number of them already do, but they do it in kind of like little areas of excellence, not everywhere in Australia through all the different areas that we can do. So what you need, I suppose now, and I think what we're seeing is the kind of incentivisation, the push-pull with e-prescribing. There's obviously funding there, transaction model for industry. There'll be hopefully some more outcome-based funding for the people who are actually doing the medical work, because if there's not, then those things won't continue to work well. They have to get a benefit, be it an efficiency benefit or a financial benefit, as well as making sure obviously that they're really happy with the outcome that they get through this interoperable health system. So I actually don't think that you can take something away once it's in place. It'd be like saying no more funding for telehealth, guys. You might have really enjoyed it, but not having that anymore. That's not going to happen, as we just saw a couple of weeks ago. Once it's there, genie out of the bottle, all of that stuff, and I can't wait to see what will happen over the next 12 months.
I agree with Emma, and I think it's great that it would be a turning point. But I think what it does do is it clearly demonstrates both to the public and to industry, and particularly to government, what can be done when it needs to be done. And the fact that, the industry has been, interoperability, again, is not a new thing. So, for, 20, 30 years, maybe we've been working on some of that. And being able to demonstrate how it can be put together properly is a really important point. So I hope that is able to continue in the same way that it has now.
I think, Trish, you've almost taken the words out of my mouth, in the sense of I think we've been able to show over the last 18 months to 2 years what's possible when we all work together and start to think differently about those experiences that we're creating. So it would be really disappointing to see if this isn't the turning point that was needed for the industry. We've been able to prove we can do it and how amazing it is when we work together. I'd hope it is the turning point that we want to see in the industry.
Chloe, on your side, are you seeing a shift in demand? Because your organisation is ultimately enabling some of the tech that's going to create this interoperability. And I know that there are multiple facets of the health industry that need to come together to support change. What's happening in Datacom? Are you seeing a shift in demand, less demand? What's your take on it?
I think demand across the board, whether you're in government, in health or in the financial sector, we've seen on the back of COVID that, consumers are really looking for more connection and from an experience point of view from their providers. And that's not isolated to the health industry, it's across the board. But what we have found with our partners is the conversation is really shifting from demand to experience. So how do we make sure that when we are interacting with consumers, how do we make that a more valuable experience? How do we leverage technology in a way that makes a better environment for the employees or the frontline staff? And really, I think the demand isn't necessarily going away, but we're all feeling the crux of, skill shortage across the board. So how do we think differently and more collective in how we approach that demand to sort of ensure that our employees, but then our consumers are also getting a better experience out of that at the same time. So I think the conversation's really shifted, particularly in government, to experiences as opposed to demand traditionally.
I'm dying to hear more on that point from Nathan and from Mark on what you're seeing in practice regarding patient demand. But obviously, Nathan, your work across innovation in hospitals, are you seeing the same things as Chloe? What are your experiences here?
I think what we're seeing is a variable and fragmented response depending upon which practice and which jurisdiction you live in. And I'll give you a very good example. If I want my rapid antigen test uploaded to my health record, tell me how that happens. And the answer is it really depends upon which arrangement, which state government has put in place yesterday. So we're still seeing a lot of bespoke solutions. And I think it's part of the problem. If you're in a Salesforce world, that's great. If you're in a Microsoft shop, that's great. Does Salesforce talk to Microsoft? Maybe. Does MedicalDirector talk to ZMedGenie best practice? Well, maybe. We've still got a lot of well maybes. And what we want from a clinician and consumer perspective is a seamless end-to-end journey. A consumer doesn't want to have to think about, does my information go here, there, everywhere? Maybe. Some information may be there. Some information may not be there. They want everything to go up, and the clinician wants a one-stop shop to see everything that relates to the healthcare, not integrated silos that are still not connected properly. So we're on a journey, and what we need, and I think most of the panelists appreciate this, is a national approach, national consistency, national standards, national agreement. And my particular pet topic has been secure messaging. We're still not able today to send a secure message from practice A to practice B or practitioner A to practice B seamlessly, despite all the great work, because we haven't had agreed standards of adoption and we haven't had, as Emma talked about, the funding mechanisms to make that happen. So we've still got a lot of work to do. We understand what the pathway is and what the potential solutions are, but we do need an injection of standardisation, and it needs to happen pretty quickly.
Great point, Nathan.
Pandemic introduced a real flurry of activity, didn't it? And the solutions that landed the best and added the most value were those that were ready to go. The preparation that had been put in over years was suddenly overnight successes in the context of a pandemic, and that's not accidental. Can that be sustained in the absence of an external crisis? I'm not so sure. I think that the pace of change may well subside a little bit, but we won't be going backwards. I think everyone now has an enhanced level of literacy about health data analytics. We all stay tuned to the COVID infection rates and the hospitalisation rates and know how many ventilators there are available or how many ICU beds there are. The ability for data to be surfaced and that value to be delivered, that understanding's not ever going away. Not ever going away, and it really highlights the value of interoperability, that common rail gauge that quickly surfaces data from the coalface to the decision makers, so that we can effectively implement change in healthcare.
Thank you, Mark. Look, one thing I'm hearing throughout the course of this conversation is that, these challenges have been long-standing. It feels like it's been a forever job to try and improve, the healthcare system, probably since it was ever begun. So this leads me into my next question, looking at chronic disease. How important do we think collaboration is in enabling coordinated care plans in the treatment of chronic disease? How well are we doing this at the moment?
I might follow on with that. Nice point. I think that the chronic disease issue is probably really well put in the context of aged care, because obviously a lot of the people in that cohort have got chronic disease. And I think that now, just like we've had with the pandemic, we've actually got a almost emergency situation with the response by the Royal Commission into aged care. And how I see it playing out is you've got a really enthusiastic population. In some case, they've been outraged, etc., by what's happened. You've actually, for the most part, got providers and service providers wanting to get this problem solved. You've got technology out there that can do most of it, but it does need what Nathan talked about, needs a business case and it needs the standards. And I think that is actually probably the biggest driver. So you've got that kind of perfect storm of political will, community, desire, you've got the technologies out there, you've got funding to assist the technologies get implemented and get improved and become conformant to standards that can be agreed through collaboration to a great end. And quite a lot of speed is required in this area because of the horrors of what came out during the Royal Commission. So I'm actually very optimistic that that whole thing with obviously chronic disease, aged care, Indigenous care, and all of that whole marketplace, which Mark talked about, we can't afford it. So it's the 80-20 rule, and so we're actually going to have to really work hard to make our health system, we'll keep it where it is at, because at the moment we have, I believe the Commonwealth Fund says, the best outcomes in the world and efficiency comes second. Maybe right, absolutely right. But look at the fact that we're probably way down, I think, below 25, and Trish probably knows this, knows the numbers, but we're way down as far as populations in the world that can access our health information in a meaningful way, in real time, the format we need. We're way down from other communities that can actually get atomised data in real time that help them to have dignity and make decisions. And that's what we need to get out of this whole interoperability.
So, what can we learn in this chronic healthcare space? Ultimately, where should interoperability belong ongoing? And, what's it going to do for our healthcare system long term?
Sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Emma. Look, the trajectory of healthcare spend in modern economies is something that we all know can't be sustained into the future, and a large burden of that healthcare spend is for chronic disease. So whilst it hasn't captured the attention of the media and the population as much, that burden of chronic healthcare is every bit as important, if not more so, particularly as we look a decade or 2 decades into the future. So population healthcare approaches and prevention of that healthcare burden, keeping people out of hospital, treating them at home, and preventing those complications of chronic disease are every bit as important as what we've confronted in the pandemic.
I think what we're talking about too, particularly with chronic disease, is more looking at how do we have new models or maybe revamped old models of things like telehealth, or moving it more towards what I would term virtual care. And you can't do that on your own. You need people, you need process, and you need the technology. And this has been all about putting those together because we've actually been able to have the technology to do all these sorts of things for quite a while. We're just not very good at implementing that. So we have standards for health data exchange, as Emma is talking about. But we don't make all the systems. Essentially they are all interoperable, but because of the way our funding models are and our business models are, there has been fewer incentives to have all of those actually work together. And this has been a prime case for improving care for individuals through putting all of those things together.
So I think this is the critical question. It's the funding models. And if I look through my practicing lifetime over about 35 years, and starting to get a bit long in the tooth, when I started, it was 8x5 cards and it was acute medicine. And now we've moved into an era of large voluminous electronic records and chronic disease as being the focus. The last 2 years, however, we've moved right away from chronic disease management. We've focused on COVID, and everything COVID. And if we look at all the data coming out over the last 2 years, we're about to see a tsunami of chronic and complex disease missed opportunities, misdiagnosis, failure to diagnose, that are going to require a huge amount of work now to get back on track. I would argue that for most of us, the systems are not in place. The software has the data, but we don't have the systems to support population health in a way that we'd like to. If you have a good general practice, and let's talk about the concept of medical homes and voluntary patient registration, you're probably going to get reasonably good outcomes most of the time, but that's for an individual. We don't have population processes of primary care at a level that we should. We do have the data locked away in individual general practices, in some hospital systems, in some specialist systems, at your pharmacy, but we haven't integrated them. My Health Record could potentially provide that pathway. We all want the e-patient Dave experience, but we haven't really defined a systematic approach to population health. And it probably does start with a medical home and then software that underpins medical homes. But again, that requires a change in the way that we think about how healthcare is delivered at a local level. And that requires a refunding or restructuring of Medicare. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Is there anything else that anyone wants to add to that point?
That's
I'll
really
just add
important.
Oh, sorry, Mark, you go again.
I think it's really important to acknowledge that the standards do exist, but there's work to be done to ensure that they're fully embraced and they become the common standard. If we think back to a time when there was different rail gauges across our country and people would have to get off one train at the border and hop on another, it's a little bit like that. You know, that the flow of data stops at the borders of our organisations and our entities. That's what we have now. The standards exist, sure, but replacing the ecosystem that we have now with the one that we want requires the right mix of incentives and regulation to replace the current state with the future state that we all want to get to.
I'd just like to respond and also add a couple of points. I so disagree with the rail gauge argument. Like, you know, Mark Twain found that really awful when he landed in Australia and had to get off the train in the middle of the night because he got on the border between Victoria and New South Wales. 2 bits of metal are so easy to get right, you know. They're 6 inches, 12 inches, centimetres. You can do it. We're talking here of thousands of terminologies, thousands of technologies, thousands of different kinds of providers, thousands of different ways of using the data. I just think, I just don't agree with that. It would have happened if it was a simple rail gauge. It's very complicated. Even every day, every minute while we're talking now, there are new terminologies coming out and disagreement about how you should actually call that new disease. So I think that is a key to this discussion, actually. It is very complicated, as I said earlier on. But the next thing I wanted to say was SAMD, Software as a Medical Device. There are some really good framework or foundational work that's been done by the Therapeutic Goods Administration in that area. I'm coming to what Nathan said, to enable that far more all-encompassing population health, whilst you're not, or if you don't have rules and regulations and conformance and standards for using artificial intelligence and all of those, you know, those things that are commonly called, you know, black boxes, then they won't happen, they won't be used. Quite rightly, providers will be concerned about using them, et cetera, et cetera. So there has, as of last February, been some really good work done there, which helps industry, and the guidelines for that are being done now. And that's really key for that big chunky bit of work, that interoperability across populations to give insights for better health and obviously efficiency. So I'm pretty optimistic about that one. Just putting it out there. I think it's been done well.
I just pick up on Emma's point, this issue about the rail gauge. I fully agree. We can certainly get to a system we can move the trains between the stations. That's not the hard bit. The hard bit's getting the passengers home. And we failed quite often to be able to get that last mile, what we call semantic interoperability. And we know we've got the technologies and the solutions, but we haven't had the wherewithal to be able to deliver that last mile. So that's...
I'm I'm going to murder the metaphor even more and say that, ripping up a whole bunch of steel rail line, it's not easy, or they would have done it at the time. These problems do, they emerge as an example of our common collective behaviour. And it's an example of the ways in which we come together when we're properly motivated and properly incentivised. So we can do it. It is just a matter of setting up the ecosystem to make it to favour its development. And it is tough. I think we all agree that it is super tough.
It's such a good point. And, we talk more about industry's lessons a bit later in the questions. So let's keep those thoughts coming. But, just looking at the incredible burnout that we have got from COVID across all levels of the industry, as a GP, I'm certainly feeling it. Do we agree with that? Have we seen that burnout from COVID across the industry? Is it going to limit our ability to continue to collaborate and innovate? Or is there a way? How can we encourage the people listening to this to build on that momentum that we've seen so far?
I think the momentum, momentum comes and goes, but I think part of the key for keeping that going is having strong leadership and being rewarded, for effort that people have put in. I think, people get much more disenfranchised when, you do a lot of things and either it's not recognised, or potentially it's not compensated for that effort that they've put in. So I think there's, it's a multifaceted problem, but, having strong leadership in the first place and being able to say, well, we want people to muster the energy to, to re-engage in what's been going on, and how do we find solutions for that? And I truly believe a lot of that comes from strong leadership and guidance.
Can I just add and absolutely endorse what Trish said? We had Minister Hunt talk to our industry halfway through all of this and subsequently. And what he did was he said, you guys have single-handedly done what I thought would take 10 years in 10 weeks. You've got this first electronic script happened in May 2020. A year really earlier than would have been expected, probably longer, working well. And not only that, having it done so well that GPs, pharmacists, and most importantly, consumers loved it and took it up. They didn't have to be paid to take it up. They didn't have to be taught. You didn't have to pay PHNs a lot of money to, try and get people to take something up. It actually just worked really well. And so that enthusiasm and that commendation from obviously the head of our health system in Australia at the moment, the minister, that went a real long way. It was an absolute shot in the arm for all of these companies that have been slogging it out. They felt really, really honoured and really proud, and actually felt part of a kind of bigger purpose, a kind of noble cause, and all of that. And I think that really helps with burnout. So more of that, as Trish said, more leadership and more recognition.
I do think that that's almost, though, the saving grace, is that there is this sense of purpose that's probably a little bit higher there, that's allowed for the frontline staff or health to sustain this sense of crisis fatigue for so long. And I certainly do wonder, there's a lot of voices in the health industry that are tired and they're burnt out. And so if we think about what's next, we sort of let's get through this Omicron and let's get through this next hurdle. It does feel like over the last 2 years, there's always a next hurdle. There hasn't really been a lot of breathing space, and that there is going to be a point in time where the leaders in the health industry are going to have to sit back and go, what do we need to do for our people to give them the time to be able to recuperate? And I'm not sure whether I've heard that as much of a conversation. There's a lot around, what's next and preparing, but, if our most important people in the front line are fatigued and tired, and you see it on the news, and this sense of crisis, this ongoing crisis, when do we start to change the conversation to be less around a crisis and more about a new norm, and give these people the break that they deserve? How do we enable the right environment where they can take the leave? Or a lot of these frontline staff, they haven't had time with their family. They've had the same sort of challenges that we in our own households have had, like working from home, kids aren't in school, yet they've still managed to show up to work every day. They're now asked to sort of attend work even if they're positive, or there's so much in that we sort of just keep asking from these people. At some point, I wonder when the discussion needs to turn to what are we going to do for them to make sure that at the end of this, on the other side, they feel as appreciated as I know that we all feel that they are. But do they genuinely feel that sense of appreciation? And when they come out of this, will they feel like it was worth it? That time away from their family and their friends. And, you know, I think that really we need to bring the human side back into it. They're not robots and they're not machines. And when do we give them that human approach to just calm themselves and have a break? And are we ready for that? Because they're going to need to be able to take their leave and reconnect with their family and themselves at the end of this crisis.
Do you feel appreciated, Nathan?
Look, I don't know if it's about appreciation, but I think healthcare professionals are going through the same sorts of issues that many people, many frontline workers are. So I wouldn't want to distinguish them as being extraordinary or exceptionally special, but it is challenging every day. I speak to all my colleagues regularly. It's the same conversation. How many vaccinations are we doing? Do we have enough staff to be able to do the vaccinations? Who's going to call in sick? What about a RAT test? What about a PCR? They're the same conversations that everybody's having. Someone described this to me a bit like an arcade game, which is electronic. You master one level, you go to the next. You master that, you go to the next. And every time you master a level, every level gets harder. You think you'll get to the end, and you never get to the end. And that's where we are at the moment. But what we have seen out of COVID is this incredible transformation, not just the medical workplace, but of society as a workplace. We're seeing more and more people work from home in telehealth environments. I mean, I see my kids, one works for the CSIRO, one works for an aerospace company. They spend 4, 5, 6 days a week working from home doing telework now. And they can take their kids to the park in the middle of the day. So there has been a bit of a trade-off. When I walk around my streets in the leafy suburbs of Brighton and Melbourne, I see so many young 25, 30-year-old men in the parks now who never saw them before. I don't think we're going to go back from that. So I think getting back to Chloe's point, we have to work out what is the new future, what is the new norm. In general practice, I don't think many practitioners will go back 5 days a week working in front of patients face-to-face. So what is a telehealth mixed world going to look like? And there's a really good Gartner report that came out recently that talks about this. We need to work out what is the optimal design of a medical centre going forwards. What are they going to look like? I look at the waiting rooms. I just sold my practices 6 months ago. I looked at the waiting rooms, and for the last 2 years, they were predominantly empty, except for when we did the big vaccination drives. Do we need waiting rooms that hold 20 or 30 people anymore? Do we need differently designed consulting rooms with multiple screens? That's, I think, the conversation we need to start now. You go into the city law firms, and they have all this wonderful floor space as you walk in and foyers that are empty. Do they need that in the CBDs? We're going to have to look at a total redesign of the way we work, and health is one of those work environments that will need to change. And telehealth requires multiple screens. I'm talking to you. I've got my Samsung Galaxy wide open. I've got my iPad. I've got my and I've got my Microsoft Surface Pro on, and I've got a screen. I've got 4 devices whilst I'm having a conversation, and I've still got a pen. I'd argue that because you've got to jot things down. Or I could use my digital pen. That might be better. But we now need multiple devices to be able to do what we used to do on an 8x5 card. And we need to think about that whole design of the work environment, because it's changed and one screen won't cut it anymore.
Yeah. Charlotte, can I just ask Nathan something, and possibly Chloe as well, coming out of that discussion? Obviously, it's been really the hardest hit people have been the medical providers. In the NHS, they used to have that clapping at night time. You know, it was widely publicised, and I thought it was very fuzzy and warm and lovely, but apparently the staff of the NHS hated it. They said, why can't they just pay us better and look after us better instead of this kind of like self-serving clapping where everyone is filmed clapping us? And I wondered, given what you've just said, the Australians, we never clapped the Department of Health or all the GPs at 6 o'clock at night. But is there something with what you've said about the workplace? Should that be the trade-off? So, okay, you've been working incredibly hard, like just dealing with the hardest thing in the world. Now, your funding for consultations, it's not going to depend on these rules which are now outdated, and all of those lifestyle things could come in to actually make it worthwhile and make them feel valued. Is that kind of where you're going, Nathan? I'm wondering. Or
I think so. I think we need to look at a trade-off between the way we used to see work, which was traditional. Well, in healthcare it was always longer, but traditionally 9 to 5 with a few weekends here and there, to it's a mixed environment where I'm working from home maybe half of my week, maybe all of my week. I've also got my family and the dog and the cat in the background. So how do we build that into an ecosystem where I can sustain my lifestyle going forward? And it's not just about my holidays, which we all love, but it's about how do I live in this new world, and how do we make that sustainable? My practice is actually now in my study at home.
I do think, with the skill shortage and on the back of, this crisis fatigue, it's probably less for people about remuneration anymore. And I think we've all sort of come to this realization, like there's a better life out there than working, 5-6 days a week, flogging 80 hours a week. I think we've got this newfound appreciation for the finer things in life. And I really think the companies that will come out ahead from an employee engagement or retention point of view at the end of COVID are the ones who really look at their employee experience and what it's like to work in those working conditions. You can pay someone the top end, but if you've got a terrible working environment, people aren't going to work for you. If you don't feel heard and you don't feel listened to, or that you're taken seriously, and I think that's where some of the health sector is it's even if you paid me double, I still would not want to work with you for these reasons. And I think as leaders, we need to get in and start to hear what our people are saying, and very clearly we'll know what to work on next, or where those real fires are that we should focus on, because our people will tell us very clearly what we need to do. And I'm not sure whether you can always put a dollar figure on that. I think, there's always consideration around remuneration. But if you've got a terrible working environment, there's no amount of money that you can pay for people to work with you, unfortunately. And that's where we probably need to start looking.
I agree.
Trish talked about this concept of virtual care. In a medical world, in any world going forwards, if I want to have my practice hours between 5 and 9, Tuesday, Thursday and Friday, I don't need to drive to the practice anymore, because if telehealth really is a permanent fixture on the landscape, let's hope it is, and I can access the software, and it's probably increasingly going to be software as a service, cloud-based software, not client peer-to-peer, we're going to see a different world. And as long as that can be supported for any provider, that's probably the model we're looking at going forwards. So my practice is anywhere, virtual care is anywhere. How do we sustain that in the next decade?
And I think that's an important point, Nathan, from, taking it from the other side, say from a patient or a consumer's point of view. It is much more convenient for me to, have a consult with my GP in the evening than it might be during the day, or, travelling an hour and waiting, because there's a whole lot of benefits there for patients, as well as the clinicians themselves, using things like telehealth and virtual care.
I'm loving where this conversation's going. What I'd like to now know, though, is how can healthcare professionals contribute to this? We've been looking at all the different ways that industry can support patient demand, but what role can healthcare professionals play, or do they need to play, or can they not? Do we need all these things to come first before any real change can be made on the ground with healthcare professionals to enable some of this innovation?
I might just start with that. I think for healthcare providers, and particularly for general practitioners, I think, having new solutions and collaborations, that we need to clearly be able to demonstrate what the benefit for the patient is for them. Because that, one of the issues that we've had with, my HR and all of our other technical solutions is it's fine, but if I'm your GP, then what is the benefit to my patient for being able to have some of those systems or have everything interconnected? Because if I usually just come and see you as my GP, then what is the benefit for me to have all those other things? And I don't think that that we've sold that very well, or the fact that we've actually clearly defined that very well in the Australian environment.
The other thing that this really brings up for me, and it's ironic that in general practice we cry out for more technology, but then you also have this funny dichotomy that we are so time poor and under pressure that we don't have time to learn and implement the new technology. I personally find this very frustrating. What are the thoughts of the group?
So Charlotte, as we started off, half an hour ago, and we talked about what was the drive, the nudge to adopt this technology. Look, you're absolutely right. It is really a complex problem. I don't have enough time to learn anything, but if I learn anything, I might actually have a little bit more time. I don't have time to organise meetings, but meetings actually are where you create structure and process. So it's that old catch-22. And I saw this when I was on the board of a public hospital. I stepped down 6 months ago. When the clinicians were surveyed about telehealth about 2 years ago, zero interest. Along comes a crisis, and guess what? Hey, this stuff's really cool. I don't have to drive an hour to flip Trish's conversation around to see a patient. I can just switch on at 10 o'clock at night and have the consultation. This is great. So there's a time and a place for everything. We don't quite understand always what those levers and what those triggers are. And going back to your earlier question about what conversation do we need to have, unfortunately, we have lots of different conversations. We don't always align them. So the needs of the individuals are not necessarily the same as the needs of the peak bodies, which are not necessarily the same of industry, which are not necessarily the same of government. What is the problem we're trying to solve? And when you look at this at a shop floor level, like there's some fantastic work around done towards patient zero. When the US expert in towards patient zero attended a whole lot of hospitals and asked the people on the shop floor, what it is that you want out of improving quality in hospitals, it's quite different to what the government wanted. So we need to somehow do this, as Enrico talks about, top-down, bottom-out, middle-out approach. We need to understand what it is that clinicians want and how do we deliver it to them, because they won't necessarily tell you. We know that people are complaining about a lot, they're disgruntled about a lot, quite justifiably. They ought to fix this, they ought to fix that. But unless we go and ask them and survey them and work with them, we won't develop the solutions that are meaningful for them.
Such a good point. It's also contextual, isn't it? And I was just thinking, as you were talking, Nathan, if I was in your shoes or in Mark's shoes, practicing medicine at the moment, you've got all this pressure, but then if you take up a new solution, you've got the medico-legal issues. Is this privacy compliant? Is it secure? What the heck? What does this technology actually link me up to? Is that privacy and security proof? So you almost need an assurance mark as well. I think if you're practicing, it's quite a big ask to say, plug this into your computer and we'll only take out that information. And yeah, we're secure, we're fine. It's quite a lot of work to make sure that that's the case at the moment, and you're a little bit on your own. So this year there is the interoperability plan, which is out for consultation at the moment. Wearing the MSIA hat, the response that we gave wasn't glowing, but it will be hopefully a very iterative process where there is combined input from all of the providers into what they need, because it isn't one size fits all. We all know that. It's very, very, very nuanced, and it has to be calibrated against what someone like you, Nathan, with 4 different devices open, does with someone like who just wants to get their work done on one laptop and that's it. So it's got that really hard pathway to go through, and I think that getting that really simple, at least we've got those fundamentals ticked off, the privacy, security and technical ability. I think that would make it a lot easier for practitioners. But who wants to say that? What do you think, Mark?
Look, it's been a number of years since I've been on the doctor side of the clinical encounter. I haven't seen a patient in quite a few years now. But I think it is too much to be asking our clinicians as well to have a deep dive on the privacy implications of their digital systems. We need to establish those privacy frameworks on their behalf as an industry and government bodies, and they just need to be rock solid. We also need to ensure that privacy requirements are flexible and practical enough to enable reuse of data for secondary purposes. The community quite rightly worries about the privacy of their healthcare, but perhaps we don't emphasise enough the value of how anonymously sharing your data can benefit society as a whole. And we saw that when the privacy model of the My Health record changed, and there was a lot of confusing messages went around. I think as an industry, it would be great if we had a really simple way to capture right at the outset of clinical encounters, consent from the patients to reuse the data for research purposes in an anonymous fashion. That's one of the key drivers, I think, that will really unlock the benefits of digital healthcare into the future. Because at the moment, we collect an awful lot of data, don't we? But a lot of it can't really be used for research purposes because we don't have those privacy and consent frameworks built in up front.
This is interesting, and it probably leads us into our next question, where the example of the industry working really well to collaborate together was around the private health insurance reforms, where multiple stakeholders, including insurers, private hospitals, AMA, medtech, all worked together to design and implement reform where focus was on the whole industry and not through a win-lose lens for individual players. We've talked about a lot of things on this call, but what is the top priority? There's a million things that we could do, but in your opinions, where should we be focusing first? And what is the opportunity for change at scale?
I'm happy to give this. I think the big issue, and we talked about this earlier, was around funding reform. If we don't focus on the system as a whole and the end-to-end journey, we can't, I think, stimulate enough people to take up new technologies. So, for example, if I'm the local specialist who uses pen and paper and I get paid episodically, a reasonable fee per consultation, there's no driver for me necessarily to swap over. If I'm a psychiatrist or a psychologist who writes my notes by pen and paper and I'm getting reasonably compensated, whatever that is, no great driver. So we have things like EPIP, for example. We fund general practice to do EPIP. Well, that's good to a point, except that's obsolete. It's now 10 years out of date, and it's not necessarily achieving anything at general practice land. So we need to, I think Emma talked about this earlier, we need to come up with an end-to-end system that stimulates enough providers and provider organisations, and increasingly they are corporatised, to support structural change. And we know what those changes probably look like, but until we start that conversation at a system-wide level, we're not going to be able to implement substantial change. You can fix one bit of the problem or one bit of the process, but you don't fix that as an end-to-end solution.
Do you think that patients or consumers, for today's conversation, I'll say consumers, I think, their needs are pretty simple when you get down to it. Like when I see someone, I want to know that I want to feel like my GP knows me. And whether that GP is set up for success for that conversation. I recently did a webinar where I used my own experience. I've got a long history of a chronic illness. And my neurologist is attached to a private hospital, of which I had to be admitted into emergency. But there was no connection between the fact that I was already a patient of that hospital. There was no, connection where my neurologist was then advised that I'd been admitted. And I still feel like the health sector is relatively reactive. And similar to what Nathan said, I do wonder, why do I have to ask my GP to upload my details into the My Health record? If I've already registered for the My Health record, why is it not automatically put there? Why are my neurologist session notes not automatically put in for my GP to be updated to know that in 4 weeks' time I'm going to need a repeat prescription for something that he's provided? And then in turn of that, why do I have to go to the GP for the repeat? Why can't that be issued by the neurologist? As a patient, I find that I have to jump through all these system loopholes or processes that have been put in there. And I go, at what point does that benefit me? Or the GP or my neurologist or the different practitioners that I need to work with for wellness. And only in it's a 15-year illness, only in the last 18 months am I at a point where I'm well enough to look at proactive wellness to make sure my condition doesn't get worse. And yet I'm then defined as not having the chronic illness anymore because I've got it to a point where I'm well and I've got to go back to phase 1 to get a Medicare plan. I think it's really looking at that system overall and going like, why are we here? What is the point of the health sector? Is it there for our patients and our GPs? And how do we set everyone up to be successful where there's less loopholes, there's less hoops to jump through, and where technology is enabled, such as the My Health record, how can we make that where it's incentivized in a way where why wouldn't my GP or neurologist automatically upload that? And why do I have to physically ask or go for that? And, I do come back to, is it designed by the people for the people? And that's not a criticism of My Health record. I love it. I think that's technology in general We go in with this technology is going to fix this, but we don't deal with the workflows that sit behind it, which is causing the frustration to begin with. Technology is a great enabler, but it isn't going to fix the shitty workflow if we haven't looked at what that is. And so I really think, a lot of the hospitals and some of the aged care providers we've been working with, the frontline staff have about 10 different systems to use. And they're like, well, we've just been given another software to use that's on top of the 11th, plus a tablet and a laptop. But where's the time for my patients? Because I'm using all these systems. And I think we've got to really work with the people who are going to be frontline using these systems and combine that with the patient experience and go, what is the outcome we're looking for here? And can we use tech to enable a better experience, more proactive or wellness care, as opposed to a reactive sort of tick and flick of a box, because that's what we've been told we need to capture. I think it's a more holistic approach, and it's certainly what we're seeing across all sectors, but for health, I certainly know it's frustrating as a patient.
Great point, Chloe.
So Chloe has really nailed it, and I think the My Health Record one's a great example. We built a wonderful piece of enabling technology that we haven't enabled, and what we want to be able to do is get the passengers home, not the trains between the stations. So we forced the poor, tired, overworked GP to create a document called the Shared Health Summary to extract some data out of a clinical software system to upload to My Health Record in order to meet the EPIP requirements so the practice gets some money, as opposed to saying, what are the key data elements that we need that from Chloe or any other patient to be uploaded to My Health Record that we could automatically extract, upload and display in a form which is meaningful and useful and usable to another healthcare provider somewhere down the track in the journey. We could fix all this tomorrow in the same way we fixed e-prescriptions in My Health Record too. We don't seem to have the political wherewithal to make that change. The RSCGP, and I'm, as an ex-chair of the National e-Health Committee and a current member, have advocated for changes around the way we do simple things like shared health summaries to move to more like the Scottish model where there's an automatic upload. But unless we get some, and this goes back to the very early conversation, unless we get some agreement with industry, agreement with government, we're not able to drive those changes. So we force GPs to do things that are of very limited value because the information is already available in the My Health Record in other forms. So we replicate data we shouldn't be replicating. So we've gone on this incredible journey over the last 15 or so years, moving from, Steve Handel talks about this, that the data is my data in my system and I own it and I'm the author, to an acceptance, I think sometimes a little bit begrudgingly by some of my colleagues, that the data is actually the data of the individual and we're there as the custodian protector. We manage it on your behalf and our software vendors manage it on your behalf. And we want that data these days. Now we recognise in the 21st century, we want that data exposed to the individual, and that individual has a right to share it with the providers of their choice. So we understand the principles, we understand the concept, and we know we've got the technology, we've got the fire and the smart on fire and the wonderful grey and grieve. We can make all this happen now. We now need to get those standards and national approaches to be able to implement it. I don't think we're that far away if we just agreed on implementing a change in the process. The current one is now 15 years obsolete.
Mark, is there anything that you wanted to bring in there?
There's two things that really shone through in that conversation. The first being a population health approach to the data. Emma spoke about what we could do with the immunisations record. Now that we've got that data in place, the standards have been established, that's there. And if we can proactively use that to identify cohorts of people that we can intervene with to get vaccinations to where it counts, then that's a really meaningful target and a proactive use of that data, which sadly we're all too often we're reactive and we're thinking much smaller rather than at the population scale. The second element is human-centred design. The design thinking from our talented creatives, that where they put themselves into the shoes of the people who are using the system, whether they be patients or clinicians, to identify really smooth and pleasing ways of using software that mean that you don't have to click 10, 15, 20 times, or you don't have to wait 10 minutes for something that should be instantaneous. Putting oneself into the position of the user in a really effective way and coming up with beautiful, pleasing software is so key to capturing the right data and to leveraging it for beneficial outcomes.
Actually, I do have something to add, Charlotte, and that is that, and in fact, nearly everybody's talked about that, and that has to do with workflow. One of the reasons that, in healthcare particularly, we don't get the results that we want necessarily, even though we have the technology solutions, is because we do not integrate it well into the normal workflow of what clinicians have to do. This has always been a problem. It's particularly a problem, in my field where I look at cybersecurity, because it's okay for the bank to say you can't have access to your money unless you do it this way, because that's the way that we say. But you can't translate that into a healthcare environment. It just doesn't work. And so we have to be much more cognizant of what it is that's in relation to the workflow to be able to put all of the technologies that may help clinicians and patients in place. And that is still a real challenge for us.
You've provided the perfect bridge there, Trish, because my next question was really looking back at the conversation that we started to have earlier around inspiration from the other industries. What do you think? What inspiration can we take from other industries? How can we make this possible? How can we inspire change if we could be so bold?
A lot of banks, interestingly enough, just last week, Lantern Pay acquired another health. Lantern Pay acquired one of our members, MSI members, and then Lantern Pay was acquired by the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Now, that's obviously one of the payment systems. Then you've got Tyro and Medipass. So there's actually, in the background of all these systems now, there's a very large shareholder in many cases coming in. And I think it's because, number one, they're commercial entities that see the value of health technology now, so they're coming in obviously to get their shareholders best value, but also I think there's from what I've seen clearly areas where they've had to deal with privacy and security, all of those things, but they haven't had the complexity. We go back to my comments on the rail gauge, it's far more complex than obviously bits of metal. So they haven't dealt with that. And that is probably when people say, oh, God, can't it be like a hotel where I don't get 10 different bills from 10 different services, the gym, the restaurant, etc. And, well, it can't in health because it is so much more complicated and there's so many different payers. You've got PBS for some, you've got private health insurance for some, you might have MBS, it might be out of pocket, etc., all through that whole complicated kind of, I suppose, very organically grown business case we've got for health in Australia that politically to upset Medicare, everyone seems really obviously very reluctant to do it. It's a national treasure, isn't it? So I'm not sure what the answer is.
It's a challenge to try and look at other industries and say we can replicate that, as Emma said, in health, because health is multifaceted and there's a human dimension to it. It's my care is about me, not about the software. I say you put $1 million in the bank, you expect the $1 million to be there the next day. If it isn't, because there's a hack, the Commonwealth Bank will, or any other bank will reinstate it. In healthcare, if there's a hack and your system goes down and no data is available, well, that's a safety risk. It's actually quite different. So we're dealing with different complexities. I guess what we could learn from other industries is that where they do form industry groups and they work collaboratively, like bank card became the first interoperable payments, credit card payment system. The banks work together eventually to create interoperability around ATMs. We've seen this with standards in telecommunications, particularly around VoIP technology, where originally it was disaggregated. Now it's become interaggregated. Mind you, we've still got problems where WhatsApp won't talk to Viber, which won't talk to Google. To Google, which won't talk to Facebook. So that's a really good example of where they've also not collaborated. But where they have collaborated, if we can build industry alliances which are multifaceted and multi-tenanted, and we did do some of this work in the early days in NETA, but the program requirements change and you can get the stakeholders involved and not everyone agrees. At least you can get to some agreed positions around requirements. At the RACGP, we did some work around the minimum requirements for general practice software. It's a good bit of work. It's not exhaustive or all-encompassing, but at least it created a flavour around a conversation. It's that sort of conversation you need to keep having where you're working with the stakeholders, with industry, and eventually to government to drive some change around the core requirements.
I love it. And it's another good segue into the last questions on my list, looking at possible opportunities within other industries to support health and wellbeing, such as the retail and consumer industries to support better nutrition and fitness, or within banking to support better payments. Or is it something we should be being more proactive and thinking about? I would describe it more as a wellness interoperability as opposed to sickness, or preventive care, if you like.
Yeah, I love, Charlotte, what you said. The preventative healthcare thing has just always puzzled me. And it comes down, and there are others on the call who probably know more about the payment divide, but primary healthcare is obviously paid for by the federal government. Then you've got the state governments doing the hospital. So if I look after my patient really well, so they don't ever go to hospital because I've been so good with their diet and exercise, etc., then who gets the benefit of that? Well, the hospitals. So the federal government will go, well, we do primary health care. The hospitals, if they're getting the benefit, they should pay. And you have this kind of really horrible problem. And I don't think it's solved yet. I think that the current minister's looked at it, and if he was staying on, I feel sure he would prosecute that. But that is so fundamental to getting what you say right, because there's no shortage of apps and other software systems that can currently be used, but they're not integrated, they're not interoperable, because there's not an actual kind of funding model for that. So a number of providers, when you're looking at what you've got to do, and you've got to pay your rent, you've got to pay, for your kids, all of those things, using something like that, which might be good, and having lectures to your clients about how it will save them, 20% less likely to go to hospital, whatever. There has to be some impetus there, and it has to come from the funding model, I believe, because, GPs are under a lot of strain. So that's my 2 cents worth on that. I think it's there, but it does need that driver to interoperability that Nathan was talking about earlier.
I think there's also a shift. So I agree with what Emma says, but I think there's also a shift to make the individual more responsible for their own health and well-being, which is where a lot of the, the well-being things come up, more these days. But I think it also requires an acceptance by the medical profession that patients can be enabled to do that. So, our old-fashioned paternalistic view needs to change around the fact that perhaps, I can have a much bigger role in that. So I might test my blood sugar every day, I might do my blood pressure, I might do all sorts of things that for me, I'm trying to, keep myself well under the guidance of my general practitioner. But more of those things become an accepted part of what becomes the conversation between a patient and a clinician. And I think that shift is also happening whether we like it or not, that is the way. It's like having apps. Does my GP recommend or prescribe a particular app? Well, that's quite a fraught area, because the quality and the reliability of apps is something that is difficult to assess. We've just finished doing a new standard actually around that, an international and ISO standard around how do you measure that? Should we have some labelling, a bit like food labelling, that belongs to apps? And that's what we've developed. So there are ways that we're going towards that, but we do need some sort of other fundamental shift, I think, in how we think about how individuals also manage their care.
Yeah, I think this is really critical. Healthcare does not start at the point you walk into your GP and the moment you walk out. It's not a 10-minute or 20-minute transaction or 30 minutes that occurs once every 2 weeks or every month or 2 or 3. Healthcare is a continuum. Preventative health has become a really, really big business. The largest companies in the world, Google and Apple, have worked that out. We all walk around now with our smart devices. We all count our steps, and if we don't, we should be. We know that the greatest predictors of well-being are how many steps you walk every day, and 7,000 apparently now is the new norm, but I do 12 because I'm a sucker for punishment. Whether you do weights and resistance training every day, you don't do that in your general practice. That happens outside your practice. Your nutrition and other well-being requirements are not done in your general practice. They're done at home. My kids know more about cooking than I ever did, and they read everything with great rigor. So health literacy is really important. The social determinants of health are really important. How do we capture that in clinical software? Great question, because no clinical software at the moment captures that in a way that is really meaningful to both a clinician or a healthcare consumer, a health consumer, as a friend of mine coined that terminology. CISCO's been doing some great work at the CSIRO for the minimum general practice primary data set. And when we've had a good look at the social determinants for health, they are really critical. If you don't have housing security and food security and other determinants of health, it doesn't matter what I as a GP do, it's not going to make any difference to you. We need to capture some of these things in clinical software. Now, how do we do that in a way that works for the clinician and the patient? I might use the patient this time around. How do we do that? Great question, because it's a workflow question and it's an interoperability question. We've got a lot more to explore, but it's not just about that 10 minutes every now and then when you see your doctor.
Thank you, Nathan. Look, I'm just conscious of time. Does anyone have any final words?
I just want to say that I'm really optimistic this year about it, because there's a lot of doubt and obviously concern about how it will happen, and all of that is justified. However, I just think that with what we've got, and I said this in the beginning with aged care, as imperatives to get this right and working, and we know technically it's not a drama, there is funding there. I think that everyone would agree that, the days of the data is mine, knowledge is power, and I'm keeping it all to myself. I mean, that's past. And so how it gets done now is the question, how it gets done, how it gets funded to satisfy most of the people most of the time. It won't be perfect, but as long as it's safe and secure and helpful, I think we'll get there. I think we'll get a long way in 2022, 23.
Thanks, Emma. Unfortunately, that is all that we have time for today. Thank you for an incredible conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time out to speak with me today.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Bye.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.